Welcome, everybody. It's good to see you here. I'm Gabriela Safran from the Slavic Department in Jewish Studies, and I'm really privileged to get to introduce Harriet Murav, who is an unbelievably prolific and exciting author on many, many topics within Russian literature, Russian Jewish literature, Yiddish literature, and then kind of beyond literature into kind of issues around culture and history. I'm not going to list Harriet's books because that would take a lot of time, and I want you all to have time to hear her speak. I will say that she'll speak today from As the Dust of the Earth, the Literature of Abandonment in Revolutionary Russia and Ukraine, which I read when it first came out, and which is just completely new and exciting, and as with all of Harriet's books, reflects this unbelievably omnivorous capacity for research and for setting together texts that are not always put together, and for showing us things that we didn't know before about reality, history, literature. So I think we will find it really fascinating. Also, I wanted to say that just in the last couple days, Harriet had another book come out, a book of translations, In the Shadow of the Holocaust, short fiction by Jewish writers from the Soviet Union, edited and translated by Harriet Murav along with Sasha Sinderovich. And I didn't say the thing that one always says at the beginning, which is, where is this person? So Harriet Murav is a professor emerita in the Center for Advanced Study at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I should have said that first. Anyway, let us welcome her.
Thank you, Gabriela, and thank you to Eva and Shana. I know how much work it is to bring one person for one campus one day, so thank you so much for all the work you put in to make my visit so very lovely. Gabriela, I hope you find comfort. So this talk and the book are about a Jewish concept and about materials written in Russian. I have a few Ukrainian materials in the book, but a great many in Yiddish. This audience probably doesn't need to know, but just in case, Yiddish is a Germanic language written in Hebrew characters whose first print works appeared in around the 10th century. On the eve of World War II, most of the world's Jews spoke Yiddish, and if you know the word glitch, you speak a little Yiddish too. But you don't have to be Jewish, have a background in Jewish studies, or know anything about the Russian Empire as it was collapsing in the period, as it collapsed 1917 to 1922, to get my point, which is the concept of abandonment, which is in the subtitle of my work. And we are seeing a great deal of abandonment today. So let's see. I'll just give you an overview of the table of contents. So this book is about poetry and catastrophe, violence and relief work, artistic literature and documentation, injury and care. The analytic lens is, and here it comes, the thing you don't know, the Jewish concept of Hefker, Hefker, originating in 2nd century Jewish property law, where it refers to objects that are ownerless, unclaimed, and up for grabs. And what we'll see today is the evolution of this concept away from a narrow technical legal meaning to a much broader set of resonances. So the book explores the multivalence of the Hefker concept as a legal, poetic, existential, and political term, showing how Yiddish poets, Russian language authors, relief workers, medical professionals, all responding to the mass anti-Jewish violence of the period of the Russian Civil War, known as pogroms, use the term hefker, to describe and to conceptualize the experience of mass public violence. I have a lot of great friends who are historians, but they tend to read literature as just a source of emotions. Oh, how expressive. And my argument is literature thinks. And the concept of Hefker is shot up in the period of the 1920s. So people who had this vast mass public violence visited upon them in the World War I through the Revolutionary period had a term, had a concept. They knew what was happening to them. They weren't merely emoting. Poets weren't merely emoting. They were conceptualizing. So to declare a population or individual beyond the realm of law, to act with abandon, to abandon an object, to abandon your ego, to make poetry wild and rough and unpoetic. These are some of the ways the term Hefker evolved, but the usefulness of the concept extends well beyond the Jewish world of the first quarter of the 20th century and maps onto contemporary critical theory as well. So, a tiny thumbnail sketch of history, which I'm sure many people in this room are more familiar with than I am. During the years following the two Russian revolutions from 1918 to 1922, the civilian population of the former Russian Empire was caught up in civil wars, anti and pro Bolshevik wars, wars of independence, Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine, for example, the remnants of World War I, and the chaos that these upheavals created. The loss of state authority made it possible for numerous insurgent groups, some of them operating in an extremely local and limited way, to exert unlimited power over the population, both Jewish and not Jewish, under their control. As many as 40,000 Jews were killed outright as Jews because they were Jews. Jewish organizations working with the Ukrainian and then the new Soviet government, Soviet Union is founded in 1922, sent teams of relief workers to killing sites armed with questionnaires to try to create order out of chaos. So the my interest in documentation and archival materials and my interest in poetry is that both are forms of. Here are some of the people that I work with: Yiddish poets and prose authors, um, the very great David Hofstein, and I'm co-editing a book on him that's coming out this year as well with Gennady Estrich. The poet turned children's book author Leib Kvitko. Many Soviet Russian works of children's literature actually originated in Yiddish, and they're by this guy, Leib Kvitko. Hadja Molodovsky, I don't think I'll have time. She didn't really write directly about pogroms, but she wrote about abandonment. The very interesting Dr. Fischl Schneerson, a scion of the Chabad Schneerson dynasty. He went to Berlin and got a degree in psychiatry and wrote a book about how to care for children who are victims of pogroms. The very good-looking Peretz Markish, whom I'm going to, a poet, I'll come back to. The prose author Itzik Kipnis, the barely known Dov Ber Levin, many people in this room will be familiar with Viktor Shklovsky, who also wrote a memoir about the disintegrating Russian Empire and used the Russian word for abandonment, not the Jewish one. Oh, okay, it's doubled. Okay, I did this already. Sorry, I'm like, Kvitko, again? You? Okay. All right, it's doubled. All right, so here are some examples of documents. I realize I don't have to walk so far, but I will. It's good exercise. So I read instructions sent by the Central Steering Committee of this group, Yev Обществом, the Jewish Society to Aid Victims of Pogroms. And here they're in Russian. You know, what should you do if you're a relief worker? Whom should you ask questions of? Here is a very sad document. It's a list of the dead in the northern Ukrainian shtetl of Sliveshna, where the Yiddish author Itzik Kipnis is from. And you can see names. Here's a guy, Frank. He was 28 years old when he was killed, and he was a tailor, and he had 2 children. Lots and lots of the archives are full of these long, 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 long lists. Here's another kind of document. Um, uh, a first person testimony, and it's from Slaviechna. You'll notice it's written in Russian, but it was probably spoken in Yiddish and translated on the spot into Russian, and you can see that there are cross-outs, so it was corrected. So all testimony is mediated, is the message of this little demonstration. So these are some of the things I worked with. I traveled to Kyiv, I traveled to Zhytomyr, but these materials, many of them are available at Urbana-Champaign, where there are 30 reels of these materials. Also, the U.S. Holocaust Museum has similar materials if you're interested. Okay, so aid workers and documents. These are the documents. Now, the definition of hefker, there it is in Hebrew. So it's a Hebrew origin term that was used by Yiddish speakers who used it differently than the originators of the term. So it's not a biblical term. It's only in the Talmud. Ownerless property and renunciation of ownership. So if I leave my jar of oil by the roadside and don't come back to get it, it's de facto hefker. Or I can make a statement for witnesses and say, I declare this Betamax VCR player hefker. All right, and it's up for grabs. And therefore, it can be legally acquired by the person who first takes it. Now, if I renounce an object, means I'm not responsible for it, right? I don't have to pay taxes on it. If you take my Hefker bicycle and it turns out to injure you, I'm also not responsible. Interesting reverberations legally. The rabbis understood, in addition, that certain objects are quote unquote naturally Hefker. So the sand, the ocean, um, wild animals, animals that live in forests and rivers. And they also had this nifty little legal mechanism called Hefker Bet Din. So the council of rabbis could say, we need your house. It's ours now. It's Hefker. So we have the same, English law has the same thing. I forget what it's, eminent domain. We need your house. We're building a highway. So your property is not quite your property in many legal systems. Okay. Now, the next slide is kind of cool. This is from the amazing Nam Stuchkov's Treasury der Oitzer, Treasury of Yiddish language. And you don't have to read Yiddish to understand that this is a very long list of words. And in here, under the heading Unherrschaft, or rulerlessness, we find Hefker and Hefkeros, and we find anarchy, and we find uh, a person who behaves like a lout and is free and easy, and Russian speakers will enjoy this second part of this term, Hefker Petrushka. Petrushka in Yiddish is parsley. Okay, so you're kind of, you behave as if there's no rules for you. Okay, you can do whatever you want. So from a legal term that means ownerless property to a person who acts as if he's under no one can call him to account, there's a big gap. There's a big change. Now, interestingly, you can tell that I like dictionaries. If you go to Roget's 1911 Thesaurus, Dictionary of Synonyms, you will find that the word abandon, in some ways, and abandonment, map on to Hefker. So you can desert someone or something, you can leave it behind, you can renounce it, right? I abandon this dwelling. You can disown, you can disavow, you can ban, outlaw, or exclude. And to behave with abandonment means to behave in a reckless, wild, or wanton way. So there are parallels between English abandonment, banning, disavowal, disowning, and all the different ways that you can use the word hefker in Hebrew and in Yiddish. Okay, all right. So what's next? Ah, now you might say, great, fine. Only lawyers and rabbis understood this term. Where is this term in common usage? An ordinary person, I'll give you an example, and you'll see where I got the title of my book from. Jews who observe the holiday of Passover celebrating the Exodus from Egypt are not permitted to hold leavened foodstuffs in their possession. So, what you do is you go through the house and you find all your bread and your cookies and your crackers, the tasty things we love to eat, and you quote unquote sell them by a legal mechanism to the rabbi. And then, of course, you miss some, so you issue a declaration. And you say, all chametz, leavened products, and anything leavened that is in my possession, whether I've seen it or not, whether I have observed it or not, whether I have removed it or not, shall be considered nullified and ownerless as the dust of the earth. And here is the word hefker. And that's where I got the title of the book. As the dust of the earth, because literary authors and victims of pogroms and victims of World War I deportations and World War II victims as well all experience this state of being as the dust of the earth. So my point in bringing up the Passover Declaration is not only to give you the source of my title, but to show you that an ordinary, uneducated Jew who might not even know how to read the prayer book would know this prayer. You would hear it. So it's a term from daily life and ordinary usage, as well as a rabbinic term. To abandon an object, to act with abandon, to be free, to be unclaimed, to create art out of this attitude, to make poetry unpoetic and not talk about great historic themes, but to talk about my body and my freedom and how I kind of feel the earth beneath my feet, to be a kind of Jewish Walt Whitman. By the way, Yiddish poets in the first quarter of the 20th century greatly admired and translated Walt Whitman, who famously sang the song of himself. So people like Peretz Markish and others, David Hofstein, they wanted to sing the song of themselves. They wanted to be wild and unfettered and free. But what does it feel like to be part of a population that's somehow beyond the realm of law? You can do anything to these people. We don't care, and there is no one to care. So it feels like you're the dust of the earth. And so the book then looks at materials from the 1919 era, both poetic works, documentary works, works of care, Shklosky's travelogue, through this analytic lens. But this kind of violence that put populations beyond the realm of care wasn't just happening in the dissolving Russian Empire. It was happening in other places in the world as well. We had the Armenian genocide, the lesser-known genocide of Assyrian Christians in northern Iran, and Shklovsky writes about this in Sentimental Journey. On the other side of the Atlantic, we have anti-Black violence, Chicago's Red Summer, that I'm going to come back to at the end, and the anti-Black pogrom in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which left hundreds of Blacks dead and destroyed the Greenwood neighborhood known as Black Wall Street. And this is a picture of Tulsa in 1921. It looks like a war zone. Now, the striking and incredibly painful thing is that even though Black citizenship was forfeited, no one was held accountable. And whereas there was massive, overwhelming documentation of the Russian Civil War anti-Jewish violence, in the case of Tulsa, evidence was destroyed. The Red Cross was not allowed to set up shop in Tulsa. And the first official report was published in 2001, which really shocked me. I was like, what? I must be reading this wrong. Okay. So abandonment as a concept in humanities and interpretive social sciences today is very widespread. And here I have just a few examples of studies that use the concept of abandonment to examine Israel's depopulated Arab spaces. This is Noam Leshem, who actually has an article about Hefker, which was one of the points of departure for my book. We have a book by Yao Biel about an asylum in Brazil, which he calls a zone of abandonment. And the really fascinating Elizabeth Povinelli, anthropologist, who writes about Australia, and this book is called Economies of Abandonment. So uh, it's a global it's not only a global object of study, it's a global phenomenon. And we have abandonment in Gaza, in Ukraine, in the US. Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia, Trump said he was powerless to seek Mr. Abrego Garcia's freedom, and El Salvador's president said he had no intention of releasing the man. So the man is stuck between he's no one's responsibility, he's Hefker. Okay. Um, The critical theory that I was referring to earlier, if you're interested, you can ask me in the questions, but it's Agamben. It's not so much the concept of bare life, but the concept of abandonment. The theory here is that the lives of citizens are temporarily clothed in rights, in norms, and entitlements, and this clothing can be taken away in numerous moments of ordinary daily life, let alone war, deportation. So Agamben writes, he who has been banned is not in fact simply set outside the law, but is rather abandoned by it. And sovereignty is the capacity to clothe and unclothe mere flesh in rights and norms and entitlements, and to decide who is clothed and who isn't. So to be abandoned is to be made mere killable flesh. And so I see parallels between Agamben's theory of abandonment and some dimensions of the Jewish concept of Hefker. But now let's go back to the 1919 period. The point, hmm, skeleton of a man, why is this? Ah, okay. Mhm. We're good. I'm good. So thinking about Agamben and thinking about Hefker was one of the points of departure for the study, and being annoyed with my friends, the historians, who say poetry just emotes, it doesn't think. And the other point of departure was reading this novel about the pogrom in Sloviansk, northern Ukraine. This novel was by a Yiddish author named Itzik Kipnis, and it was published in 1926, and it's called Hadoshim and Teg. Here's Hadoshim. That means months, and un teg, and days. It's an account, a first-person account of the hero's experience of the pogrom in July, and it uses real names. I showed you on a list the individual named Frank, who was a tailor. Kipnis refers to someone named Frank, who was a tailor, and he uses, I checked in the archival sources, and he uses names and addresses. So it's truly a documentary novel. But the thing that got me thinking was the sentence I've quoted here, and I'll read it in Yiddish, you can read it in English. It's seien mir geglichen zu Beschäftigten, was an Abend wären sie in ganzen Hefker und hilflos. Now we were like animals, which at nightfall would become utterly abandoned and helpless. So the people are like livestock whose owner removes them from care, depriving them of food and security. Notice, and this is key, he didn't say, now we were like animals to be sent for slaughter. He said, now we are like animals who were abandoned. So abandonment is the precondition for wild slaughter, for violence that's untrammeled. And I think Kipnis, who was not a highly educated man, he was a leather worker, by the way, understood something about this concept, and it kind of it resonated with me, and this was one of the points of departure for the study in its entirety. Now I'm going to give you another example, which is quite different from Kipnis. This is by the Yiddish poet Hofstein, who was highly educated, and some in the room may be aware and already know that David Hofstein teamed up with Marc Chagall to write Hofstein wrote an 11-poem cycle called Treue, which means sorrow or grief, and Chagall did the graphics. And here you can see the word Treue, and the R is like the shofar, the horn that's blown to bring Jews to prayer, to assemble them. It's an extremely rich text. I think that is really hardly been discussed in the critical literature. Yes, there are some articles, but it needs a lot more explanation. So when I will come to the Hefker word in a second, but I want to set up how I think Hofstein is projecting himself as a literary author. I think he's projecting himself like an archivist. He's projecting himself as someone who isn't creating this poetry of sorrow, but is gathering it, listening to it, and pulling it together. What are you still in a position to do? He rather sadly asks himself, the most beautiful, the purest, the greatest of pains of sorrows, you can still receive. Okay, he's a someone who's taking in something, a slight string of verses, rhymed and compressed, a slight string of verses on a crumpled page, drifting about someplace over there in giant baskets of years. So it's interesting that Hoshtin himself went to this steering committee of the Jewish Committee to Aid Victims of Pogroms and said, let's not just send relief workers to killing sites. Let's send poets and literary authors and let them also write about what happened. And no one liked his idea. But he wrote this beautiful poem cycle that had experimental graphics. We had poem letters of the page going down the page. We had a poem that unfolded in a circle. Very experimental, very, very modernist, and very, very sad. All right, so here comes Hofstein's use of Hefker in this great poem cycle. I'm going to skip this, the wonderful, what happened to it? No, this is the wrong. Hmm. I'm going to be sad because I can't find. Oh, here it is. Sorry. Not my computer. Okay. Um, so here later in the same poem, Hofstein asks, how can I what am I still in a position to do? This is the answer to the same question. If you should have the fortune, if you should be lucky enough, if your song, dein Lied, could be Azoy Hefker. Now, problem for translator. It's not unclaimed, right? If your song could be as unclaimed as your song can be ownerless, what? What could that mean? So I am looking for the right translation, and I've got here many choices. Wild, open, self-renouncing, because he's not creating, right? He's gathering. If your song could be, let's just say Hefker for now. If your song could be as Hefker as the bloody drops, abandoned, on the far snows of Siberia, would this not be comfort? And this should, I didn't give the whole Yiddish. There's another meaning of Hefker that I haven't shared yet. And it's a very beautiful kind of spiritual practice known as Hefker Kamidbar, Hefker like the wilderness. The idea is that the Torah was given in the wilderness. And in order to receive God's word, you have to empty yourself. It maps very well onto Christian kenosis, self-emptying. No ego. And many Hasidic rabbis in Hofstein's milieu, a little same time as him, a little bit before, wrote about the importance of self-renunciation. Quiet the inner voice in order to receive. So I still don't know how to translate Hefker here, but you can see that it doesn't mean abandoned, and it doesn't mean unclaimed and free and wild. It means something else, and I'm not sure I'm going to find the right English translation of this term in this context. But the idea is that if the poem and the poet could be as open to the other, permeable, exposed, vulnerable, similarly to the blood left on the snow in the poem A Hunter Kills a fox in the snows of Siberia. If you could be like that, it could provide comfort. If a human gaze could gather these drops, then would this not be comfort? Then is das nicht kein Trost, ne? Is this comfort? Just to know that your pain is being received by someone who is open and willing to be in pain. You might say, "Oh, you're so overinterpreting," but that's what I'm thinking. Um, I think I have. Do I have? I have a little bit. I have more time. I always lose track of time when I talk. Um, Here is a completely different Hefker usage. This is from the poet Hadja Maladovsky, who I've kind of rushed through. This is a poem from 1933, and it has to do with a prison ship that actually existed named Chaco that left Argentina, and it had various criminals and political activists and union organizers, and no, the ship couldn't sail anywhere, and she wrote the couldn't dock anywhere, and she wrote this poem in which the keyword Hefker appears here. So the ship sails against wind and sky, iron waves, wreathe it in prison bars, cannon snouts hunt the ship down on the furthest widest ocean. The ship sails against wind and sky, and the wild waters welcome it to their common lot. Remember the rabbi said the ocean is Hefker? So she uses the word Hefker right here, their common lot. Abandonment, howling unruly waves carry it away, the moon with a mother's pale face floating nearby. So this is really, it's a Yiddish poem, but it's really not primarily about Jews. And it's not about Eastern Europe. And I just wanted to show you the use of the term. Okay, so here is another usage, and this is newspapers from 1919. Um, uh, the Jew in Eastern Europe, wie in a Hefkerwald, in an abandoned woods, was Gott verloren hat von Blick, which God took away, his countenance no longer shone upon it. The Azoi is a Yid Hefker in Poland, a Jew, how abandoned a Jew is in Poland. And these are just snippets from many Yiddish newspapers. These, again, not poets, not rabbis, not highbrow individuals, like ordinary people understanding this term. Okay, so I'm moving to my conclusion. And the conclusion really doesn't, that's Kvitko. Oh, this is Kvitko. I didn't mention him. He writes a whole um, series of pogrom poems called 1919, but I'm gonna skip through in the interest of time. I want to end here. There's a wonderful poet in Chicago named Eve Ewing who wrote a poem cycle called 1919. When I was writing the book, anything that said 1919 kind of jumped out at me. And it turned out she did a really interesting thing. She wrote a poem cycle based on the 1922 report, The Negro in Chicago. This documentary report was about Chicago's July 1919 race riot, in which a young black man swam accidentally in the non-visible barrier separating the black and white swimming area, and a riot ensued in which thousands of people lost their homes. And Eve Ewing writes a whole poem cycle about this, in which she transforms the fairly hateful language of the report, which urged that blacks be deported basically from the US, and then there wouldn't be any more race riots. She transforms these words into a message that's much full of hope, much more full of hope, and much more full of promise that something else could be done. And she uses the voice of a child to enunciate this hope. So just to give you a little tiny example, quote, "You said hope for a solution through the dying out of the Negro race." And then she keeps rewriting this and rewriting this. And finally, the last line is, "You said hope, taking away the dying out." So poetry, and I'd like to point out, as many of you know, that poetry today in Ukraine is a form of hope. Poets are publishing on Facebook every day, lots and lots of poetry, and it's kind of keeping people together. So, just to sum up, the works I discussed elaborate the meanings of Hefker as freedom, openness, wildness, but also dispossession and rightlessness. My argument is that even in the midst of abandonment, poems, documentary reports, lists constitute a form of care. That poets and aid workers were trying to remove victims from a zone of abandonment to a zone of care, even if only in minimal form. Care in the sense of attention to them by naming them, even by counting them. The other big picture argument is that literature thinks, and that Jewish writers in the first quarter of the 20th century, writing in Yiddish, had a concept readily available to hand, Hefker, that they could use to think with about the mass violence that was happening to them. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm sorry. My class let out late, so I came a little bit behind. I'm wondering how 1919 and the Russian Civil War would maps onto 1917 and the role of the Jews having seeing the Red Army as liberatory and the White Army, and I'm wondering the way that that interacts here with the political moment.
Yeah. I mean, the role of Jews as Bolsheviks was greatly exaggerated in anti-Jewish agitation of the time. Somebody has written a whole book about this, Judeo-Bolshevism, and the name is not coming. The author isn't coming to mind, but the title of the book. So I did not examine the violence perpetrated by state and near-state armies. So the Ukrainian army perpetrated violence, Denikin's army perpetrated violence, and the agitation was that Jews, for example, in the pogrom in Slaveshna, in which only 60 people were killed, the agitation was Jews are going to take over churches. You won't be able to get married unless a rabbi gives permission. And also a non-political agitation. Jews are hoarding salt. Jews are hoarding salt. And there was a tremendous shortage of manufactured goods. And you can bet that anyone who had salt adulterated it and sold it and price gouged. That probably did happen. But the entire realm was also in famine. And there was complete economic shutdown. Harvests were ruined. There was no manufacturing. So the opportunity to exacerbate people's fears and anxieties, I hate to say this, but when there's economic trouble, there's nothing like a little fomenting of hatred to distract from the economic trouble, right? So agitation along the lines of the stereotypical and exaggerated Jews are Bolsheviks was definitely at play in the violence. On the other hand, I read accounts where Christian neighbors would lend Jewish neighbors icons to put in their windows. So a marauding band would walk past this house because it had an icon in the window. Care was taken sometimes. Mhm.
Thank you very much for this very moving and illuminating talk. I have two questions and take them as you like. One is I'm curious, in one of the poems, I don't know the name right now, in one of the poems you showed us, Hefner can be read as either abandonment or hope. There's this aspect of being free in the poem Hefner. Hefner. And yeah, here. And I was wondering if you saw this in other poems or literature of the time, um, the possibility to read it in ambiguous ways. Um, and and, and I guess a bigger question, um, where do you I'm curious, where do you see Hefker in later periods and later literary periods? And what can this term do for us, not just as scholars, but as people in this world?
Okay. I don't think hope is really at play here in this poem. My argument here is that Hefker clearly in this line from Hochstein can't mean wild. It can't mean it really can't mean pure. It has to mean something else. Now, Seth Wolitz, who is no longer with us, a wonderful Yiddish scholar and translator, translated it as, I think he translated it as wild. I don't really remember, but I think Hochstein in particular, given the prehistory up to 1922, he wrote other poems in which he talked about himself as a poet not writing but gathering. So he gathered his poetry, for example, in a work from 1919, which is still the same period. He gathered his poems from abandoned fields, from Hefkerfelden. So there's something about an open space in which you are vulnerable, you are exposed, you are not the author of what has taken place there, you are not the creator, but you see it and you pick it up and you incorporate it and you make art out of it. And it so happens I'm quite fascinated by him. His wife complained that he used to walk on the street and pick up abandoned like lamps and typewriters and bring them home and claim to be able to fix them, but he never could. So there's kind of a motif here of I am not like God the creator. I come and I gather together and I repair. And that's really where I'm coming from. So it's not exactly hope, but it's something other than you're less than human. Your pain can't possibly. I don't care about your pain. The term Hefker continues through the World War II period and beyond. I mean, if you look at Yiddish literature of World War II period, what is our blood? Hefker, Dam Hefker, Hefker blood, abandoned blood. It continued. There was the AIDS crisis and the era of the Ethiopian exodus to Israel. Blood banks in Israel wouldn't take blood donations from Ethiopians because of anxiety about AIDS, and Ethiopian demonstrators said, "What is our blood, Hefker?" So the term has, and it's still used today. It's used in in the observant community. Certain bodily products and fluids, can they be considered? Can they be used? Like stem cell research. I mean, it's if someone left their bicycle and you rode it away and it was faulty and you were injured, are you responsible? That's one very specific legal usage, but I think it can be used today for the way somehow we find it possible to put a 5-year, detain a 5-year-old, or put a 5-year-old in a cage, or arrest someone going to church. What are they? Because they're possibly an immigrant, they're abandoned by law, and you can do whatever you want to them. I think it's a very compelling term for this zone of law, or what's right outside law, that raises questions about who gets the benefit of law. And I think we have a president who's decided he is a sovereign and not a president bound by law. That's a very powerful term, I think, today.
I have various questions, but I'll start with one. And having followed your work from when you were a graduate student, and I was a beginning professor, and we were in the same classroom, it's that your work on Dostoevsky and the word kenosis, and their frequent reference to the word kenosis, the meaning of kenosis, the holy fool, as somebody who has emptied himself of reason in order to be open for God's illegible, not understandable word and sounds and things like that. So I really liked the fact that you came to a paragraph or two where you had Dostoevsky. It was incredibly compact, and I was dying to start asking you questions at that point. And so one question that I have is, was there a history of theological relation between the word Hefker, which is ancient, and the word kenosis, since they're from different etymological systems.
Well, yeah, kenosis is Greek, hefker is Hebrew, but scholars of Judaism do talk about Jewish kenosis. It doesn't, it really, I don't think there's, okay, there's difference in practice. I don't think there's so much difference in concept because, okay, there is a difference in concept. Kenosis is based on the incarnation, right? Jesus was one with God and descended into human form, emptied himself to become human in order to save the world from sin. And so if we're already down here, how do we imitate Jesus? We go lower, right? We seemingly empty ourselves of reason. So various Hasidic masters, not in imitation of Jesus, believe that the soul was constantly on a journey. It could ascend or descend. It could, and rationality was something that you could abandon and pick up, abandon and pick up. And I have not made a detailed study of the theology. Shaul Magid has written a lot about Hasidism and has talked about this. I mean, Moshe Idel, as in addition, and the very impossible to understand. There's one other guy.
Wolfson.
Yep, him. Wolfson have written about this as well. And there was plenty of Hasidic practice, and I think an argument. And since I was, a very young scholar, I pretty much think there's an argument to be made for a certain amount of syncretism. That there has to have been some kind of exchange. I mean, the rabbis very much valued rationality, the interpretation of the law. Along comes, the Baal Shem Tov in the 18th century and says, not so important, maybe. Spiritual states are important. And you can reach those spiritual states, not necessarily by knowing every jot and tittle of the law. The psychiatrist Schneerson, who came from the Schneerson dynasty, wrote several novels of Hasidic life, which are virtually incomprehensible to me because the Yiddish is Hasidic Yiddish, and that means it's almost all Hebrew, and it's all these kind of talks by Hasidic masters. And one of the novels is called Chaim Gravitzer, and it's about a man who abandons the law. He doesn't say the necessary prayers when his son dies. He doesn't observe the laws of mourning, and he kind of goes wild for a bit. I think R.J. Turner in Paris is translating this novel. I'm not sure. But I'm not a theological historian, and I don't have Hebrew. And I think the study that would have to be written to examine this syncretism is not one that I could do. Yeah, but I believe that there had to have been commonalities. Yes. Yes.
I love this. When the word came up, exile used by the Tsarists for their own literature stars like Pushkin and Dostoevsky, and also the Soviet period, the exiles, and how Hefker and exile, is there a connection there that you see? Because I see that exile and abandonment or loss and the primordial soup of putting all these people together and having to create a community to survive in their abandonment.
Not so much the word exile, but I mean, Jews were displaced in the interwar period. And Uri Tzvi Grinberg, who started out as a Yiddish writer and became a Hebrew writer and left Europe and went to Palestine, wrote a great deal about dislocation. And he didn't use the word exile, but let us use it right now. Exile as a factor of Jewish life in the interwar period. And so did other Yiddish poets who talked about homelessness. And the name is going to escape me. It's somewhere in the book. Somebody published a very short run of a journal, and it was called From Yiddish's Homeless Press. So the self-characterization as a homeless individual was very current in the interwar period. And all the writers I talked about, Kvitko, not Kipnis, he's a little younger, Kvitko and Markish, and I didn't mention Der Nister, and Bergelson, whom I've written about and who writes about Hefker. They all left revolutionary Russia. They all went to Berlin for periods of time. Hofstein went from Russia to Berlin to Palestine and then back to Russia. Bergelson didn't leave Berlin until 1933. So people were in motion. They were moving around. Post-revolutionary Russia, and I mean the whole former empire, was a very cold, a very hungry, and a very dangerous place to be. Yeah.
Yes. Um, so I read this book, when it first came out. I thought about it a lot, and in listening to you, I've realized I have even more questions. I think the thing that I've been thinking about listening is there. It's very moving how you describe the various ways in which things and people can become Hefker because of individual choices or legal declarations, or because of state choices or declarations, um, or because of behavior by groups. Um, and then you also describe ways in which care happens in spite of Hefkerness or in response to it.
Mhm.
Care sometimes by individuals, by neighbors who left icons, um, or by kind of NGOs,
Yeah,
right?
NGOs,
Sending
exactly.
sending care workers. Um, I'm wondering if there is as kind of beautiful a keyword for care, and if there isn't, what does that mean? Um, Maybe that's just my first question. I
Okay.
can ask more later.
Okay. Um,
Does the language force you into a kind of, let's look at the Hefka more than the care? And something that I've always
yes.
admired about this project, which I think I heard you first talk about more than a decade ago, is the way that you refuse to only pay attention to the violence. You also pay attention to the care. That's so inspirational.
Yeah. I remember when I first it was at Evo, right? I talked about Kipnis. Um, no word is springing to mind that indicates care, and I think we have to, you know, we're all into trauma, right? We're more into trauma than we are into recovery. Now, Schneerson makes a big point of this, actually. He says we need to see resourcefulness, enterprisingness, energy, creativity, even in children who are, quote unquote, stony faced after trauma. And so I don't think there's one umbrella word. And I think it's important to identify these moments of care. They're episodic. They're not they're not state organized. I mean, yes, there were lots of committees and lots of aid workers and lots of attempts to provide clothing and food and shelter, to provide aid. Pomosh, I mean, in Russian, aid. Dopomoga in Ukrainian. In Yiddish, it's the word is not coming to mind. But you gather them up, these moments. And I think, um, actually, there's a moment in Kipnis, another moment. He's talking about he and his pregnant wife and his father and mother and other family members leave the town and go to the countryside, and they don't know where to go. And the dad of the family, the patriarch, he said, my good friend, peasant X, will let us in. But good friend is away, and the young child, the 14-year-old master of the house that's left, doesn't want to let them in. So they sort of sleep in the courtyard. And an old woman appears, and she's dressed a little crazily. She has like one apron in the front and one apron in the back, and does she have just a shift underneath? And she comes out and she starts cursing out the Jews. You didn't give us salt. You sold us adulterated salt. Even animals are given salt. And she goes back in the house, and as a reader, you kind of brace yourself. And she comes out with baked potatoes to give the children. And so I don't even think she knew what I mean, imagine this really happened. She didn't know what she was gonna do, right? And there's other moments like this, strange, very strange moments that, like in Life and Fate, there's another moment where now the Germans, the occupiers, the oppressors, now they're the prisoners, and they're being forced, and I should have warned, this is a very violent topic. They're being forced to carry out the bodies of the dead from a basement, and there's a crowd of Russians, Ukrainians that have formed, and there's a woman who has a brick in her pocket. And you think, oh, she's going to throw a brick at one of these prisoners and he's going to be dead. But instead, there's a piece of bread also in her pocket, and she throws the piece of bread and the person gets to eat something. So I mean, can there be an umbrella word? You know, the opening in Life and Fate is about how the word dobrota, goodness, is no good. We need a word that's very individualized and unpredictable. I think it's the unpredictability of care that is so striking in these stories. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
Let us thank Harriet Murav.